divide it up, or you're
No, no, I'm gonna
Oh,
eat it in front of all of you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. It's 3:37. This is Senate Education on Friday, January 6th. We have Jill Campbell with us from the Agency of Education, who's going to give us an overview of ESSER and LEA funds, how they're used, what they are, that kind of thing.
All right.
So the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Jill Campbell, Vermont Agency of Education. Official title, COVID-19 Federal Emergency Funds Program Manager. As Senator Campion knows, other duties as assigned.
Right.
So he may be seeing me on other topics as well. So what I was thinking today is, again, just a real introduction. And I will do my best to not throw too many acronyms at you. Try to design it as such. Hayden, if you wouldn't mind the next slide. So just defining, we'll almost never call it anything but ESSER. But what it stands for is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. There's been 3 of these. These are pandemic funds. The first one happened way back in spring of 2020 through the CARES Act. There was a larger tranche of funding, and I've got a graph for you in just a moment, a larger tranche of funding that came through the Carissa Act in December of 2021, and then the ARP ESSER funds came through in March of 2021, and of course those are much, much bigger. So that is what that stands for, and as I said, we'll never call it its full name again, we'll just call it ESSER funding. I also want to just signal something. When we're talking about federal funds, we use the term LEA, local education entity. In Vermont, you can just translate that to our supervisory unions and supervisory districts. So you'll hear me accidentally use the term LEA a lot, but just think that's what that is. It's at that top level of supervisory union or district. And then you'll also hear me use the term period of performance. And this is a very specific definition when you're talking about grants. And it's the period of time in which an entity, an LEA in this case, needs to obligate or encumber its funds, right? So that means it needs to have signed contracts, it needs to have completed the work. So I think that like an HVAC system is a great example. So they need to have the contract, they need to have completed the project, even if they haven't actually paid the invoice during that period of performance. And this is critical in understanding what's happening with our ESSER funds. All of our grants operate on a reimbursement basis. So we award the funds, the district goes out and spends the funds, and then they ask for reimbursement. So when we ask the question, have they expended their funds? That's maybe not the right question, because that can happen way after any actual obligations have been made, activities have been carried out. And so you'll see that I'll show you how much money has been expended, but really it's about the obligation. Have they budgeted it? Have they actually engaged in contracts and activities and hired staff? That's the critical question, not have they sought reimbursement from the Agency of Education. Okay, go on to the next one. Thanks, Hayden. All right, so to help with this, I just wanted to signal a couple of new tools that we have created since last session. So the first of these is we created an education recovery and revitalization website. And within that, we actually have, currently we have 2, but it will be 3 later this week, I hope, or not later this week, early next week, dashboards. And these are transparency dashboards. And would you mind clicking on the ESSER and Gear LEA dashboard? Thanks. And these are available to any member of the public. And what these are going to show, hopefully, it'll go for you, is data that we have pulled from our grants management system. And again, because of that difference between expended funds and obligated funds, what we show and what we're pulling from here is what are in the budgets of the approved applications. So what have the districts said that they're going to use the funds for? And we have said, yes, that is allowable. We will award you those funds. So anyone can go on this, any person, member of the public. There's 2 screens. And so this is those supervisory union and district level funds. You can search by the fund, you can search by the supervisory union, and you can also search by the org ID if you're a data-minded person. Hayden, if you wouldn't mind going to the next tab on that. Which is
Can I
at the
ask a
bottom. Yeah,
quick
please.
question? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
The,
Sorry, I'll go back.
no worries, the number was 403 million, I think it
Yes.
was. So those are one-time funds.
They are one-time funds, and
Okay.
I'll talk about those periods of obligation
Okay,
in just a
thank you.
minute. Yeah, hang tight for me, but yes, that's a great question. So what you'll see is that we have our SR1 funds. That was about $28 million that went to our supervisory unions. We have SR2 funds. That was about 114 million, 112 million. And then ARP Esser, which is about $256 million. One-time funds with specific end dates. And I'll tell you what those are.
And can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
And everything needed to be connected to COVID recovery as
Yeah.
it relates to this.
That's right. So the broad use of allowable costs is very, very big. Really one of the most expansive grants I think that we've ever seen. However, the reasonable and necessary piece comes down to, does it prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID-19?
Right.
Early on, responding to COVID-19, preparing and preventing COVID-19 really translated, and you can see this into things like PPE, hiring COVID coordinators, installing plexiglass barriers, outdoor classroom spaces, those like really critical
Family engagement officers were a big
family
thing.
engagement officers,
Yeah.
purchasing of Chromebooks during remote learning,
Yeah.
those immediate emergency responses, right? Over time, responding to COVID-19 really is becoming responding to the impacts of COVID-19. So we can see that while the main focus, and this is one of the things that I'll show you in a moment, while the main focus has always been on academic supports, direct academic supports for students, we do also see that what we call safe and healthy schools, which can include everything from the hiring of nurses to PPE and plexiglass to HVAC systems. And the way that we categorized these spending categories is pulled actually directly from the budgets. So whenever a district puts in a budget in a grant application, they have to follow the uniform chart of accounts, and there's function codes and object codes. And so we actually took those function codes and we put them into spending categories. So everybody has the same spending categories. So this is a tool that's available now. I recommend that you go in and play around. You can look at your local district. You can look at the differences. You can look at how spending has changed over time. So it's a pretty exciting tool. We really hope that it aids in conversations about the funds. It helps folks to get a better sense of like what's happening in my district. And so we're really excited about this tool. We actually have a state level dashboard that's going live like any minute, any day now. I was hoping it would be ready, but we ran into a little bit of a technical error with it. So that is going to show something a little bit different. We're not pulling from budget and function codes. We're actually pulling from my giant spreadsheets that I keep, but it will show you the story of how we're using the state level dollars, and I will be very, very happy to come in and talk about this as well. Yeah.
So,
Yes, Senator.
so these are all summaries of essentially 3 fiscal years, 20,
Yes.
21, 22?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So Hayden, if you wouldn't mind going back to the slide deck.
Yep.
That's great. So if you look on, Hayden, if you can go to slide 4. So this is the those allocations, those that came from the federal government. They were driven by a formula that's tied to Title I, which is a poverty metric that's used to drive our Title I funding, and it's the same formula for ESSER funds. And that is what determined how much each district got. And there is 90% of the funds go to the districts, and they are responsible for how they get spent. They make those decisions. The agency's responsibility is to make sure that they are reasonable and necessary. So we're going to check it against that. If you can go to the next slide. And they do have 3 periods of performance. So the first is SR1. and that period of performance ended in September. So that one is done and dusted, as we like to say. It's in the closeout period right now. So even though it shows remaining funds, I want to caveat that. That's accurate, but not, because we are actually closing these out right now. So the district submitted their final closeout reports on December 28th, and the AOE is in the process of doing those reimbursements. I personally made a lot of phone calls to make sure that we met those deadlines, and can say with confidence that we are really not leaving a lot of money on the table. They did a really good job of fully expending their funds. And so we will be returning a very small portion back to the federal government, like tiny, tiny slice. If you go to the next slide, maybe. So the next one coming up is SR2. And so that is September 30th of this year. As you can see, we've paid out a good chunk. So this is the actual expenditure, right? So this is an obligation. They have fully budgeted, and we had a deadline of last year for that. They've fully budgeted their SR2 funds. They have a plan for them. They are out there spending the dollars. But we've also actually paid out a significant portion of this. So there's about $41 million remaining, and they're in the process of doing that work now. We've told them, spend your funds in the order in which they expire, right? I know that there's a lot of our ESSER funds, but don't be out there spending them until you've spent down your SR2. So they sort of are following those instructions. And Hayden, if you can do the next slide. Our ESSER is sort of the big enchilada there. So you can see we have a ways to go. In November 1st, our districts were required to submit their fully budgeted ARP-ESSER applications. So they had some time. There was required stakeholder engagement and public comment. They have a mandatory 20% set aside directly for student learning impacts. So it was a much more intensive process than the first two. I would say the first two, it was like, get your investments in there and get going, right? We're sort of in emergency mode. Now we're in more strategic planning mode. Think about what your needs are and how you're going to address them with these one-time funds. So we do know that they have fully budgeted and have full grant awards at this time. So that gives us some confidence that they know what they're doing. They have the opportunity to amend, and they have out to September 30th of 2024. So those are the nuts and bolts of these. And I'll just spend a little bit of time sort of saying, like, what do we know? Where are we at right now with these funds? So here's the big takeaways. The big takeaways is that they are spending these dollars. There is, I think, because of a lack of understanding on the national scale of the difference between an obligation and an expenditure, there's been a really strong narrative that, like, the districts aren't spending these dollars, they're spending these dollars, right? They showed us with SR1 that they are doing this. They've showed us with their fully budgeted awards that they have a plan. So we know that they're spending their dollars.
Jill, may I ask a quick question?
Please, yeah.
Do you have a sense of how people generally went about their decision making? Was it superintendent pulled the principals in, or any? I'm sure it's across the board in terms of making their own priorities.
We have a really good sense when it comes to SR2 and ARP-ESSER.
Okay.
So, and actually my next slide talks
Yeah,
about that.
great.
So I'm gonna ask you to hold on that. So what we know when we look at the data is that where they are spending most of their investment is probably where we would like them to, right? They're not going off the rails. We're not building sports stadiums here in Vermont. They are using 53% of total spending is going for academic and student learning and impacts of the pandemic, direct student supports. And then the other place that they're investing heavily is in the safe and healthy schools. And as I said, that includes sort of a grab bag. Obviously, we would expect that the higher dollar numbers there are coming from facilities improvements. And we've seen, and again, I'm happy to come back and we can talk about school construction with federal funds. That's a whole other topic. But we have a pretty comprehensive report on the kinds of projects they're doing, and most of it's HVAC work. And then there's a lot of other kinds of improvements to our aging facilities that are also being carried out. Improvements to support student learning, outdoor learning spaces, a whole variety of things. Hayden, if you wouldn't mind doing the next slide. Okay, so how did they make these decisions? So because, as Secretary French pointed to, we had such a strong pandemic response, our schools were in better position than many other districts in the nation to start thinking about in winter of 2021, what we've called education, recovery, and revitalization. And then Delta and Omicron hit, and we all sort of had to deal with that, and we're heavily involved in sort of that emergency response again. But what they were able to do, and what we required them to do in winter of 2021, was to take a breath and do a needs assessment, right? We really needed data on what was happening to our students. And so they did a needs assessment, and then we asked them to develop an education recovery plan. And that education recovery, those pillars have been sort of our guiding framework, both at the district level and at the state level in terms of how we use the ESSER funds. And those pillars are student engagement. That was particularly important in 2021, where it was like, we have lost some students, we need to get them back in school. We invested really heavily in summer opportunities to get them ready for the next school year. So student engagement was really important early on. Social, emotional, and mental health has really been a major focus and a major source of investment, both at the state and the district level. Academic achievement and safe and healthy schools. So those are our driving kind of foci or pillars. And we asked them to create education recovery plans around those pillars based on needs. And then to your question, Senator Campion, the next step was when they did their SR2 applications, and then very specifically their ARP ESSER application is actually broken out into those 4 buckets. How is this investment that you're doing tied in with one of these 4 buckets? And what is your evidence base for this strategy? You're hiring a literacy interventionist. What is the evidence base for that? How does this tie in with your education recovery planning? So that began with strong recommendations in the SR2, but it's now a requirement of ARP ESSER. So we've sort of brought more data to bear as we move through. The other critical piece with ARP ESSER funding, which is again the bulk of it, it's most of the funding, is that districts were required to engage with stakeholders. And there was a very specific list from the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, about who those groups were, how they, we gave them some strong recommendations about how to engage. And when they submitted their ARP ESSER applications, they actually had to submit their documentation of engagement. And we did send applications back and said, you know, you really, okay, you posted this. You know, we had a lot of folks who said, we keep holding Zoom calls, nobody shows up, what do we do, you know? And so we would try to provide that technical assistance and that outreach. We used examples from districts that were really doing a fantastic job, and we would share, we do a weekly or a bi-weekly phone call with the field, and we'd have people come in and give examples. So they had to document that they had done that stakeholder engagement. It didn't mean that they had to do everything that their school community said they had to do, but they did have to engage in the process, and they had to show how they took that feedback. So that's part of the application. All right, and then the last piece of identifying needs is that this October, we sort of finally got the national NAEP scores. So data on math and literacy scores came in and have been informing decision-making, although I would say there's, you know, probably in early stages with that.
Was that a routine test that you do every year, or was that special in response?
No, it's supposed to be done every year, but the pandemic actually disrupted it for, I think,
Right, but I
2
mean,
years.
so prior to COVID,
Yeah.
it was.
So we do have that longitudinal data. It's 4th and 8th grade reading and math. So we do have that ability to look at it. I'm definitely out over my skis if I try to speak to it. But we tend to see the kinds of trends that were happening before COVID. are continuing post-COVID. And I would have Amanda Gorham come in and speak to you about that. That is absolutely her wheelhouse. Yeah. All right. So last kind of things, and then we'll get you out of there or have some questions. Go ahead, Hayden. All right. So what are some of the things that we've been seeing? Lots and lots. We're continuing to pull what we call Esser Stories and highlighting things that are working.
Great.
But one of the things that we've seen, I sort of just did a quick scan this morning. So in Burlington, we've seen some really heavy investment in what they're categorizing as academic interventions and instruction, and then restorative practices. So the kinds of investments that we're seeing there, which are pretty heavy, hiring of specialist staff, so literacy and math interventionists, also hiring folks to support restorative practices within classrooms. We know that behavioral incidents are way up in schools. So investing in staff, professional development, screening tools to be able to address those issues in school. In Southwest Vermont, they are investing very heavily in some outdated HVAC systems in all of their schools. So major undertaking happening there. And a major investment in high quality summer and after school programs. And we know that those work, those have a strong evidence base. And so we nationally, we're starting to see a decrease in that. We're not seeing that so much in Vermont. We are continuing to see pretty strong investment there. All right, and Hayden, if you wouldn't mind. All right, in Rutland County, I looked just at Greater Rutland SU. There's, a lot I could look at over there. But again, I was sort of grabbing some quick highlights here. We're seeing, again, targeting of academics, investment in math and literacy interventionists, so highly qualified individuals to come in, investment in screening tools, the kinds of things that Jess was talking about, those tools that are going to let you know early whether or not a student needs some additional supports and professional development around those. We also see continued investment in what I would call 21st century learning. So we have a lot of districts, they had to do it early on when everybody went remote, but they're continuing this investment of making sure that we have like one-to-one student with laptop, but also recognizing that in many areas of our state, families don't have access to Wi-Fi. So they've invested in mobile hotspots to be able to expand that access, which is really critical. So those are some of the highlights. And then this is a piece that I would say I would love to come back and talk about, because this is something that I'm really heavily engaged in. I'm really excited about it and working really closely with Jeff Francis at the Vermont Superintendents Association, but also superintendents and business managers. So what are some of the challenges that they're facing? It's the same story nationally as it is locally. So what we know is that capacity is an issue. I talk to folks in school districts all day. They are exhausted. When I say we've got a new grant opportunity, I literally hear a groan, which is unusual. And so we are looking at ways that we can alleviate that burden as much as possible. We're doing contracts instead of grants, but also to make space for strategic planning, right? And to make space to implement programs in a really tight time frame. They're very challenged by that. Everyone is nationally challenged by that. They also are just challenged by the crunch to find talent and vendors, right? So you want to hire literacy interventionists, you've identified that it's a critical need and there's no bodies to fill those positions, right? Or you've identified that your HVAC system is a nightmare and you really have the funding right now to do this once in a generation opportunity. And I can tell you that the contractors are booked and the supply chains are full. There isn't a great solution to either one of those problems. And the other thing that is becoming important, and is something that I've been really like waving my hand up, and saying, hey, start thinking about this, is what we're lovingly calling the fiscal cliff, right? So what happens in FY25? These are one-time funds, right? How do we support the districts? And this is something near and dear to my heart, so I do want to talk more about it, to identify what's worked, right? We did this intervention, this strategy, this initiative, and wow, did it have a great impact? We don't have the dollars for that. What do we do? And so we are working right now on helping the districts to do that analysis on their behalf, give them actionable information, and then look at what are the other funding streams you already have that you could use to continue those impactful programs. And what do you need to make some hard decisions about? You know, we did hire 15 literacy interventionists. We really, really needed them. What did we get for it? And do we have a soft landing? Can we plan for a soft landing? Or will it be a bloodletting, which is what we want to avoid? So that's work that we're undertaking right now with, frankly, great urgency. I spend a lot of time working with a consulting firm that we've hired to do this work. So I'd love to come back and talk about that.
So that was terrific presentation.
gosh,
Yes,
so good.
Senator Williams, please.
A three-part question. I got
Okay, I'm
I got
ready.
I got some experience with spending federal dollars.
Yeah.
They don't normally give you the money till, or let you commit it until they have it.
Mhm.
Who provides oversight on the spending? One.
Yeah.
Two is, what is the state, our responsibility for making sure it's properly spent?
Mhm.
I mean, are we gonna wait for the 87,000 IRS agents to be hired and then they're gonna come back and day in on us because we misspent the money?
Mhm.
And what are we doing about these people we're hiring, knowing that the federal dollars are gonna go away and the state isn't gonna be able to pay it?
Yeah. So to your first two questions, the ultimate responsibility for oversight for these funds lies with the Agency of Education. We're the pass-through entity. We handle federal grants all day long, and in a lot of ways, that's almost the function of the AOE, and in some portion of it, right, is to push out federal dollars and protect the federal interests and make sure they're being spent right. So we have lots of checkpoints along the way. One thing I'll sort of highlight that's been new and different and challenging is that usually in the normal course of business, federal dollars are not available to support construction. It's just not a thing that exists, but oh boy, does it exist now. And so we built a process from scratch, and it's been tested thoroughly. I would say with strong confidence, because I'm on these calls a lot, that our state approach has been conservative but protective of our districts. So when I compare it to other states, I think that we've taken the right actions. I think that we are much less at risk of having our districts have costs disallowed and have to be returned. And so even though at times I'm sure folks have torn their hair out a little bit, I think it's going to benefit us. And we monitor them. So we do annual monitoring. It's comprehensive. It's fiscal and programmatic, and we go out into the field and we look at the dollars and we talk through it with them. So there's checkpoints all along the way. I would say that I work really, really closely with our Director of Fiscal and Regulatory Compliance, and I feel in those calls with other states that our approach, our careful and thoughtful approach will benefit us. So I feel good about it. We talk a lot about protecting the federal dollar and the taxpayer dollar. Yeah. And to that question about staff, that is the question that we're struggling with. Yeah. And
Yes, Senator.
Yeah.
Wood.
Did you pull those data from our districts on purpose?
I did.
That's impressive. You are magna cum laude right here.
Right.
That's
Say I
awesome.
did some Google
Thank
searching
you.
this morning on all of you would be accurate.
Yeah.
Thank you. That does help.
Oh, did you notice that?
So nice.
Any other questions before we let go? Hey, that was terrific. That was really helpful.
That
We're all
was
hearing
overwhelming.
what your concern, also the concern that you also is what happens next.
Yeah.
And we can have you back and talk about that.
Love to.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the state set aside dollars. We have, I don't know, 42 different initiatives that we've done with those state set aside dollars, and many of them are being handled by Jess and her team, and they're
Right.
spectacular. So, and then I'm sure you'll see me for PCBs and school
Great.
construction.
No, I appreciate that.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you all
That
so
was
much for
terrific.
bearing with me. Appreciate it.
Great. And thanks, everybody.